The North Sea churned black beneath an October sky in 1589. The waves rose like cathedral spires before crashing down with the force of divine wrath. Somewhere in that maelstrom, a young king clung to the beam of a dying ship. The vessel groaned and screamed as if alive. Below deck, trapped horses shrieked in panic. This was no ordinary storm. This was the moment that would transform a scholar into history's most feared witch hunter. King James VI of Scotland was 23 years old. He was brilliant, paranoid, and in love with a woman he had never met. For months, he had waited for his bride, Princess Anne of Denmark. But the North Sea, that ancient graveyard of ships, refused to let her pass. Storm after storm drove her fleet back to Danish ports. It was as if nature itself opposed their union. To understand what happened next, we must understand the mind behind it. The mind that would soon write the world's most dangerous book on witchcraft. James Stewart had inherited more than a crown. He had inherited a legacy of violence and fear. His father was murdered when he was barely a year old. His mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, was forced to abdicate. The child king was left a pawn among scheming nobles. He survived kidnapping attempts and watched trusted advisors turn traitor. Before he could walk, he had learned that invisible forces were always against him. This childhood of constant threat had produced a peculiar kind of genius. James was fluent in Greek, Latin, French, and English by adolescence. He wrote poetry, debated theology with the finest minds of his age. He possessed an intellect that would later earn him the backhanded compliment of being called the wisest fool in Christendom. Yet beneath this scholarly exterior lurked a mind prone to seeing patterns where none existed, conspiracies and coincidences, and supernatural explanations for natural phenomena. When the Danish fleet failed to deliver his bride for the third time, the Scottish court began to whisper. These were not normal storms. The violence of the weather, its persistence, its seemingly targeted nature, all pointed to something more sinister than mere misfortune. In an age where the boundary between the natural and supernatural was permeable, witches were never far from blame. At universities, learned men debated the mechanics of demonic possession with the same seriousness they discussed astronomy. So when whispers claimed witches were attacking the royal marriage, it was not dismissed as superstition. It was considered a legitimate possibility. Then James made a decision that would alter the course of history. Against all counsel, defying both protocol and common sense, he declared that he would personally sail to Denmark to fetch his bride. "If she cannot come to me," he announced to his stunned court, "then I shall go to her." Picture the scene: a king who had never left Scotland. He had grown up surrounded by plots and assassination attempts, and now he chose to venture across the most dangerous waters in Europe during storm season. His advisors must have thought him mad, but James was driven by something more powerful than reason. A toxic combination of romantic idealism and the need to prove his sovereignty over the elements themselves. The journey to Denmark was harrowing. James's small fleet battled through walls of water that rose 60 feet high, through winds that tore sails like paper and snapped masts like twigs. The king himself, violently seasick and terrified, spent much of the voyage in prayer. Yet somewhere in that terror, a transformation was beginning. Every crash of thunder, every impossible wave that somehow didn't sink them, every moment they survived when they should have died, all of it was filing away in James's methodical mind. He was creating a pattern that would soon demand an explanation. Miraculously, they reached Denmark. James met Anne, and they were married in Oslo with all the pomp befitting a royal union. The young king was triumphant. He had defied the elements, claimed his bride, and proven his courage. But fate, or something far darker, was not finished with him. The Danish court where James spent the winter of 1589 to 1590 was a place of sophisticated learning and progressive Protestant theology. It was also, crucially, in the grip of witch-hunting fever. Denmark had been conducting systematic witch trials for years. Its theologians had developed a comprehensive demonology that went far beyond folk superstition. These were not peasants fearing old women who gathered herbs by moonlight. These were scholars who had created an entire systematic theology of Satan's earthly operations. During those long Scandinavian nights, as snow piled against castle windows and candlelight threw dancing shadows on stone walls, James engaged in lengthy discussions with Danish theologians and nobles. They spoke of organized covens operating like inverse churches, of witches who could command weather, sink ships, and strike at God's anointed representatives on earth. They told him, with academic certainty, that the storms preventing Anne's voyage had been no accident. They had been a deliberate supernatural assault, orchestrated by Danish witches in league with the devil himself. They had targeted the Protestant alliance between Scotland and Denmark. For James, this was revelation. The paranoid architecture of his mind, built through years of real conspiracies and threats, suddenly had a framework that explained everything. His lifelong sense of being under attack, the unnatural persistence of the storms, the near miraculous nature of his survival, it all crystallized into a single, terrifying certainty. He was not merely a king trying to rule an earthly kingdom. He was a warrior in a cosmic battle between God and Satan, and the devil had personally marked him for destruction. Spring arrived, and with it came the journey home. James and Anne, now accompanied by a grand Danish fleet befitting their royal status, set sail for Scotland. The king must have felt protected, surrounded by Danish military might and blessed by his successful marriage. He could not have been more wrong. The storm that struck them in the North Sea defied all natural explanation, at least in the minds of those who survived it. This was not weather, it was warfare. Waves rose like moving mountains, black and tremendous, before crashing down with impacts that shook ships to their frames. The wind didn't simply blow. It shrieked with what survivors would later swear sounded like human voices, like laughter, like screaming, "The royal fleet," despite its size and the skill of its sailors, was scattered like toys. In the chaos, one ship, carrying wedding gifts and several members of the royal household, vanished entirely beneath the waves. One moment it was there, fighting to stay afloat. The next, the sea had swallowed it whole, taking every soul aboard into the depths. The flagship itself, carrying the king and his 14-year-old queen, suffered catastrophic damage. The the main mast snapped with a sound like cannon fire. Water poured through gaps in the hull that opened and closed, with each wave like breathing wounds. Below deck, horses screamed in terror. Their cries mixed with the prayers of courtiers who had faced battle without flinching, but now they wept openly, certain their death had come. And through it all, James experienced something that would haunt him forever. The absolute conviction that this was not natural, not random, not simply bad weather. In the howling wind, he heard intention. In the malevolent precision of waves that seemed to target his ship specifically, he saw design. This was not God testing him. This was the devil trying to kill him. When the battered remnants of the fleet finally limped into Leith Harbor, James fell to his knees and kissed the ground. But the man who rose from that gesture of gratitude was fundamentally changed. The scholarly king who had left Scotland was gone, drowned somewhere in those black waters. In his place stood something far more dangerous. A survivor who believed he had looked directly into the face of supernatural evil and lived to tell about it. As he stood on that dock, soaked with salt water and shaking not from cold, but from a terrible new understanding, James had only one question burning in his mind. Not, how did we survive? Or why did this happen? But something far more specific and infinitely more dangerous. Who did this to me? He could not have known that the answer to that question was already being prepared. Confessions were being extracted in Danish dungeons that would soon point fingers across the sea to Scotland. He could not have known that his demand for answers would ignite the most infamous witch trials in Scottish history, or that the book he would write about his experiences would become a manual for persecution that would span continents and centuries. All he knew in that moment was that someone, somewhere, had used the powers of hell itself to try to murder God's anointed king. And he would not rest until he had found them, exposed them, and destroyed them utterly. The hunt for the witches of Scotland was about to begin. The answer King James sought came wrapped in the flesh of a young woman named Guileless Duncan, though neither she nor the king knew it yet. While James was still settling back into Holyrood Palace, still waking from nightmares of black water and screaming winds, the machinery of accusation was already grinding into motion in the small towns surrounding Edinburgh. Guileless Duncan was everything a witch was not supposed to be. Young, not old. Beautiful, not withered. Helpful, not malicious. She worked as a maidservant for David Seaton, the deputy bailiff of Tranent, and possessed what her neighbors called an uncanny gift for healing. Where others saw only suffering, Guileless seemed to perceive the root of illness. Her hands, when laid upon the sick, brought relief that trained physicians could not achieve. In any other time, she might have been revered. In the autumn of 1590, she was doomed. The chain of events that would lead from Guileless Duncan to the king himself began with the most human of emotions. Suspicion born of incomprehension. David Seaton could not understand how a simple serving girl possessed such abilities. When she slipped out at night, perhaps to gather herbs by moonlight as healers had done for centuries, perhaps to meet a lover, perhaps simply to escape the suffocating confines of servitude, Seaton's inability to explain her gifts transformed into something darker, in the atmosphere of paranoia that had descended upon Scotland like fog, unexplained talent became evidence of diabolic compact. What happened next in Seaton's house established the template for everything that would follow. When confronted, Gillis denied any involvement with witchcraft. She insisted, simply a healer, using knowledge passed down through generations of wise women. But Seaton and his associates had not gathered to investigate truth. They had gathered to extract confession. The difference between these two objectives would cost thousands of lives across Europe. But it began here, in a small room where a young woman's fingers were about to be crushed in the pillywinks. The pillywinks, thumb screws by another name, were the opening movement in a symphony of pain that had been perfected over centuries. They crushed fingers joint by joint, each turn of the screw calculated to produce maximum agony while keeping the victim conscious and capable of speech. Gillis Duncan proved stronger than expected. Even as her fingers were destroyed, she maintained her innocence. So her interrogators escalated to the next movement, the search for the devil's mark. This examination was perhaps the most insidious aspect of witch hunting, combining sexual humiliation with predetermined outcome. The accused would be stripped naked, shaved of all body hair, and examined intimately for any blemish, mole, or scar. That could be declared the spot where Satan had marked his follower. The prickers who conducted these examinations often used special pins with retractable points, ensuring they would find what they sought, a spot that would not bleed when pierced. It was a test designed to be failed. They found such a mark on Gillis Duncan. Combined with the torture, it broke her. The strong young woman who had entered that room ceased to exist. What remained was a creature of pure pain, willing to say anything to make it stop. And what she said would ignite a conflagration that would consume dozens of lives and transform a king into a monster. Yes, she confessed. She was a witch. Yes, she had made a pact with the devil. But more importantly, and this was the mechanism that transformed individual accusation into mass hysteria, she was not alone. The mythology of witchcraft insisted that witches worked in covens, gathering in blasphemous assemblies that parodied Christian worship. Once broken, the accused had only one possible path to mercy: naming others. The more names, the more cooperation, the more chance of a quick death rather than a slow one. Gillis Duncan began to name names like a fountain spewing poison. Some were predictable, other healing women, social outcasts, the perpetually unfortunate. But she also named respectable members of society, people whose position should have protected them. Among these names, one stood out with particular resonance: Agnes Sampson, known as the Wise Wife of Keith. Agnes Sampson represented everything that threatened the new order James was unconsciously creating. She was elderly, respected, educated in her own way, and possessed of knowledge that existed outside male-dominated institutions. As a midwife, she literally controlled the gates of life and death. She knew secrets of the body that university-trained physicians did not. She commanded respect based not on title or appointment, but on competence and wisdom, accumulated over decades. In short, she was exactly the kind of woman that a patriarchal, paranoid society needed to destroy. When they brought Agnes Sampson before King James himself at Holyrood Palace, something extraordinary happened. She looked the King of Scotland in the eye and told him he was wrong. Not with hysteria or panic, but with calm certainty. She was a good Christian woman. She helped bring life into the world. She eased suffering. She had done nothing wrong, and she would not confess to crimes she had not committed. For James, this defiance was intolerable. His entire New World view, the elaborate theological framework he had constructed to explain his survival of the storms, depended on the existence of this conspiracy. Agnes Sampson's composure was not evidence of innocence, but proof of Satan's protection. No mere woman could defy a king unless she served a higher or lower power. The king gave the order that would damn him through history, break her completely. What they did to Agnes Sampson in the dungeons of Edinburgh represents the absolute nadir of human cruelty dressed in legal procedure. They shaved her entire body searching for devil's marks. They found what they wanted to find. Then they applied the witch's bridle, a device that deserves description not for sensationalism, but because understanding its horror is essential to understanding what followed. The bridle was an iron cage for the head with 4 sharp prongs that penetrated the mouth. 2 pressed down on the tongue, 2 pierced the cheeks. It made speech impossible, swallowing agony, breathing difficult. It was designed not just to inflict pain, but to silence the literal metallic enforcement of male authority over female speech. They chained Agnes Sampson to a wall with this device locked onto her head and kept her awake for days. No sleep, no rest, no respite from pain, just the constant whispered questions of her tormentors and the taste of her own blood. After 53 hours of this torment, Agnes Sampson broke entirely. When they finally removed the bridle, the confession that poured from her destroyed lips was everything James needed to hear and more. She was indeed a witch, she said. She led a coven of 200. They had met with the devil himself in the North Berwick Kirk, where Satan had preached from the pulpit, calling each witch by name, commanding them to work evil against the king. The confession grew more elaborate with each session. They had sailed to their meetings in sieves, she said, a mockery of natural law. They had christened a cat with blasphemous rites, tied parts of a dead man to its body, and thrown it into the sea while chanting curses to raise the storms that nearly killed the king. They had made a wax image of James himself, planning to melt it slowly in fire so that the king would waste away as the wax dissolved. James transcribed it all, his pen scratching across parchment with the intensity of revelation. Here was proof of everything he had suspected. Not just witchcraft, but witchcraft directed specifically at him. Not just heresy, but treason. Not just a few malcontents, but an entire anti-kingdom with Satan as its monarch and James's own subjects as its citizens. Yet even in his paranoid triumph, a seed of scholarly skepticism remained. James was, after all, an intellectual. He pressed Agnes Sampson on specifics. Oh, how could she, a mortal woman, have known where his ship was in that vast sea? How could her curses have found their target so precisely? He accused her of lying, of exaggerating, of claiming powers she could not possibly possess. What happened next became the pivot point of not just this trial, but of James's entire transformation from king to demonologist. Agnes Sampson, broken beyond recovery, perhaps seeing a way to ensure her place in the dark legend she was being forced to create, asked the king to come closer. She was too weak to speak loudly, she said. She had something to tell him that was for his ears alone. James, irritated but curious, leaned down from his throne. This woman who had defied him, who had been broken by his command, who now existed only as a vessel for confession, whispered something in his ear. We will never know the exact words, but we know their subject matter. She told him in precise detail the private words he had spoken to Queen Anne on their wedding night in Oslo. Words that no spy could have overheard. Words that no human agency could have conveyed across the North Sea. The records state simply that King James fled the room. Not walked, not departed, but fled, a king running from an old woman in chains. In that moment, every scholarly doubt evaporated. Every rational explanation crumbled. If Agnes Sampson knew words spoken in the ultimate privacy of the royal bedchamber, there was only one possible explanation. Satan had told her. The conspiracy was real. The threat was real. The war between God and the devil was real. And James was not just a participant, but a primary target. When James entered that dungeon, he was a frightened king seeking answers. When he fled from Agnes Sampson's whisper, he was something far more dangerous. A true believer with royal power and intellectual credentials. The trials would continue, the executions would multiply, but the real transformation was complete. The scholar king was about to become an author, and the book he would write would spread this terror far beyond Scotland's borders, creating a manual for murder that would outlive him by centuries. Agnes Sampson died at Castle Hill as the morning sun struggled through Edinburgh's smoke. They strangled her first with rope, a mercy by the standards of the time, before setting her corpse ablaze. As the flames consumed the body of the wise wife of Keith, they were destroying more than flesh. They were incinerating centuries of female knowledge, of healing traditions passed mother to daughter, of wisdom that existed outside the approved channels of male authority. The fire that took Agnes Sampson was a funeral pyre for an entire way of understanding the world. But King James VI was not watching the execution. He was in his private chambers at Holyrood Palace, surrounded by books, papers, and the instruments of scholarship. The man who had fled in terror from Agnes Sampson's whisper had transformed that fear into something far more dangerous than panic: methodology. He was writing, and what he was writing would become the most influential manual of persecution ever penned by a monarch. The book he crafted was titled Demonology, the Science of Demons. This was no fevered rant scrawled in the heat of paranoia. James approached his subject with the same scholarly rigor he had once applied to theology and poetry. He structured it as a philosophical dialogue, a conversation between Philomathes and Epistemon, a format borrowed from the classical texts he so admired. This stylistic choice was deliberate and devastating. By presenting his arguments in the form of rational discourse, James gave his paranoid convictions the appearance of academic legitimacy. The Scotland that James ruled while writing his treatise had become a laboratory of terror. The North Berwick trials had expanded far beyond their original scope. What began with Gilus Duncan's broken fingers had metastasized into a systematic purge. Dozens were arrested, tortured, and executed. The social fabric of entire communities unraveled as neighbor accused neighbor, as old grievances found expression in accusations of witchcraft, as the machinery of persecution, once set in motion, proved impossible to stop. Yet James saw none of this as excess. Each confession, no matter how fantastic, confirmed his thesis. Each execution was a victory in the cosmic war he believed himself to be fighting. And each day spent writing Demonology was a day spent forging weapons for future warriors in this eternal conflict. The book, completed in 1597, was a masterwork of intellectual horror. In clear, persuasive prose, James laid out a complete system for understanding and combating witchcraft. He explained how the devil recruited followers, arguing with particular vehemence that women were especially susceptible due to their natural weakness and insatiable appetite for revenge. He categorized types of demonic magic, distinguishing between necromancy, divination, and direct diabolic possession. He provided detailed instructions for identifying witches, including the significance of the devil's mark and the validity of spectral evidence. Most crucially, James addressed the skeptics. He understood that educated readers might doubt the reality of witchcraft. To these potential critics, James delivered his most dangerous argument. To deny the existence of witchcraft was itself a form of heresy. If one believed in God, one must believe in the devil. If one believed in the devil, one must believe in his earthly agents. To doubt witches was to doubt Scripture itself. This theological trap was brilliantly constructed and horrifyingly effective. It transformed skepticism from a rational position into a spiritual danger. Those who questioned witch trials were not displaying wisdom, but revealing their own potential corruption. The book created an intellectual framework where accusation became virtuous and doubt became suspicious. When Demonology was published, it carried the full weight of royal authority. This was not merely a book by James Stewart, private citizen. This was a treatise by the King of Scotland, soon to be King of England as well. It bore the royal seal. It was, in effect, government-sanctioned guidance for finding and destroying witches. The book spread through Europe's educated classes like intellectual plague. Translating paranoia into policy, fear into law. In 1603, James inherited the English throne, becoming James I of England, while remaining James VI of Scotland. He brought with him his book, his fears, and his absolute conviction that he was surrounded by supernatural enemies. Within a year, England had passed a new Witchcraft Act, directly influenced by Demonology, making witchcraft a capital crime punishable by death. The book became required reading for judges, magistrates, and anyone involved in prosecuting suspected witches. A new profession emerged in the wake of James's work, the witch finder. These men, armed with Demonology as their manual, traveled from town to town, offering their services in identifying hidden witches. They charged fees for each witch discovered, creating a financial incentive for accusation. They carried special pins for finding devil's marks, implements for conducting swimming tests where the accused were thrown into water to see if they would float. Floating indicated guilt, as water, being pure, would reject evil. and copies of the king's book to lend authority to their actions. The most notorious of these witch-finders, Matthew Hopkins, would later claim to possess a special commission from Parliament. Though no such commission existed, what he did possess was demonology, which he quoted extensively in his own writings. During his brief but terrible career from 1644 to 1647, Hopkins was responsible for the deaths of more accused witches than had been executed in the previous century. Each victim died under the shadow of James's intellectual authority. But the book's most terrible journey was yet to come. In the early 17th century, as James's tome circulated through Europe's libraries and courts, ships were carrying English Puritans across the Atlantic to establish new communities in the New World. These settlers brought with them their faith, their fears, and their books. Among these books, carefully wrapped against salt spray and treated as the precious cargo it was believed to be, was Demonology. The Puritans who settled in Massachusetts were not ignorant peasants, driven by primitive superstition. They were, in many cases, highly educated individuals who had attended Oxford and Cambridge. They established Harvard College just 6 years after founding Boston. They valued learning, literacy, and logical argument. And it was precisely this intellectual sophistication that made demonology so dangerous in their hands. When strange behaviors began manifesting in Salem Village in 1692, when young girls started experiencing fits and visions, when accusations of witchcraft began to fly, the educated men tasked with understanding these events turned to their libraries. There they found King James's book, with its clear explanations of spectral evidence, its theological justification for persecution, and its royal imprimatur lending authority to their darkest suspicions. Cotton Mather, one of the most influential ministers in colonial Massachusetts and a key figure in the Salem trials, owned multiple books on witchcraft. But demonology held special significance. Here was guidance not from some obscure theologian, but from a king who had personally faced witches and survived. James's descriptions of witch meetings matched what the accused in Salem were confessing under pressure. His explanations of how the devil operated provided a framework for understanding the chaos engulfing their community. The Salem trials, which resulted in 20 executions and the deaths of several more accused in prison, were not an American aberration. They were the direct descendant of the North Berwick trials, connected by the intellectual DNA of demonology. The fears of a Scottish king crystallized into prose and published with royal authority had crossed an ocean in a century to claim new victims. What makes this transmission of terror so particularly horrifying is its intellectual respectability. Demonology was not folk superstition or mob hysteria committed to paper. It was a carefully reasoned, eloquently written, philosophically structured argument for the reality of witchcraft and the necessity of persecution. It gave educated people permission to believe in witches, and more terribly, a moral imperative to destroy them. The book remained influential well into the 18th century. Even as Enlightenment thinkers began to challenge the reality of witchcraft, demonology continued to be cited by those who resisted the tide of skepticism. Its arguments were too well constructed, its authority too weighty, its integration of theology and law too seamless to be easily dismissed. Every reprinting spread the poison further. Every citation in legal proceedings claimed new victims. Every reader who nodded along with James's seemingly reasonable arguments became complicit in the machinery of death he had designed. King James himself lived until 1625, long enough to see his book established as the authoritative text on witchcraft in the English-speaking world. In his later years, he occasionally expressed doubts about some specific cases, even intervening to prevent a few executions when the evidence seemed particularly weak. But he never renounced demonology, never acknowledged the horror he had unleashed, never connected the broken body of Agnes Sampson with the countless other broken bodies his words had created. The ultimate tragedy of this story lies not in the individual deaths, horrible as they were, but in the transformation of fear into philosophy, of paranoia into policy, of one man's terror into universal law. James believed he was protecting Christianity from Satan's assault. He thought his book was a shield for the faithful, a sword against evil. He could not see that he had become the very evil he sought to fight, that his ink was blood, that his scholarship was murder dressed in academic robes. Today, original copies of Demonology rest in climate-controlled rooms in the world's great libraries. Their pages no longer spreading active persecution, but bearing permanent witness to the horror that unfolds when power combines with paranoia, when intelligence serves fear, when the pen truly becomes mightier than the sword and infinitely more terrible. The book stands as humanity's darkest reminder that our greatest atrocities are not committed by monsters, but by brilliant, frightened people who believe they are doing good. The storm that nearly drowned King James in 1589 lasted only days. The storm he created with demonology raged for centuries. And in some dark corners of human consciousness, it rages still. Every conspiracy theory that leads to violence, every moral panic that destroys innocent lives, every moment when fear overrides reason and intellectual authority validates persecution, all are part of James's true legacy. He sought to fight the devil and instead became his most effective servant, proving that the road to damnation is paved not just with good intentions, but with footnotes, citations, and the royal seal of approval. The witches King James feared never existed, but the evil he unleashed in hunting them was terrifyingly, undeniably, historically real. And that, perhaps, is the most haunting truth of all. We need no devil to create hell on earth. We need only a frightened, brilliant person with a pen, convinced they are saving the world.